Alrighty. Hey, so thanks for coming out to Black Hat Europe. I want to give a quick shout out to the folks who put this on. It is a tremendous effort to get all this set up, the audio visual, all the keynote stuff that you just went to, the vendor hall. If you've never been at the setup for one of these conferences, it's just monumental. So thanks for everybody putting that on. I'm Jake. We're going to be talking about conducting a successful false flag operation, also known as Blame It on China. And I'd be worried about this if I weren't already PNG'd in China, right? So I can't go back, and I am officially not invited back. So I'm okay with blaming stuff on China at this point, and any of the countries that we talk about here, I probably can't go back to anyway. So anywho, so who am I? For those that don't know me, I founded Rendition InfoSec. I'm an IANS faculty member. I've got my GSE, but not my CISSP. I do a little bit of posting on Twitter, and then was formally endorsed a while back by the Shadow Brokers. That was pretty cool, not that we know who they are. I mean, I'm not saying anything here necessarily, but the little Shadow Brokers folks. As far as likes, I love offensive cyber operations, forensics, and CTI. Really resonated. CTI being, of course, cyber threat intelligence. What Malware Unicorn talked about at the keynote really resonated with me because my work actually started in architecture, network security architecture, and then moved into offensive work, and then pivoted into forensics. And the forensics stuff that I do, the forensics work that I do, it's largely like playing chess with the adversary, where they've already played their moves already, and it's just a lot of fun there. So offense informs defense, defense informs offense. Dislikes. If anybody tells you they're a thought leader, they're not a thought leader, right? That's it, right? If they have to tell you, they're not that person, right? Also, blockchain. I'm not saying that I hate blockchain in general, but when you needlessly add it to a solution, ugh. So what are we going to talk about? First, a couple definitions and disclaimers. Then I'm getting into the cyber kill chain. And I know people either love or hate the cyber kill chain or both. Whatever, right? That's fine. We'll talk about it. The reason I bring it up here, and we'll move through this, of course, is that I need a framework. I need some way to talk about attacker actions, and before somebody's like, but MITRE ATT&CK only covers the stuff after the post-exploitation, and that's like a tiny piece of what we're doing overall in an operation. And then, of course, we'll talk about false flag techniques, the reason that we're here, and give a couple of closing thoughts and wrap it up. So, lots of prior work here. Bartholomew and I'm not going to try to pronounce the other dude's name there, Saad, I guess, from Kaspersky have done a lot of work on this. I've done a couple of presentations on it in the past. There's another gentleman here, not trying to pronounce that either, but Filigus or something along those lines. Said I wasn't going to try it, and then I did. You get the idea. Anyway, there's been some prior work here as well. Needed to define a term here. I thought everybody knew what a patsy was, and I was given a talk at DerbyCon on kind of the same ish topic here, although much more from a defense side. How do we find evidence of false flags versus actually trying to conduct a false flag operation? We're here at Black Hat. We're going to talk about actually conducting a false flag operation as opposed to just researching one. But folks came up afterwards and they said, what is a patsy? And for those that don't know, patsy, right, is a person who's easily swindled or deceived or coerced. They're a sucker, right? Person who takes the blame for something, the fall guy, right? The scapegoat. And so when I use the word patsy in the talk here, basically when we talk about a false flag operation, we are trying to blame our hacking activities on someone else. Now, typically, the someone else is one nation state trying to blame another nation state for the operation, right? So they become the patsy. We have to pick a patsy. Somebody's going to take the fall for us here. Now, sometimes in confidence games, cons, basically, you'll hear somebody refer to the sucker as the mark. For whatever reason, calling a whole country a mark just feels weird, whereas I feel like the patsy country, I don't know, it just works out better for me. So when you hear patsy, taking feedback from the last talk, I figured, hey, let's do this, right? We'll at least cover what this is up front. Few disclaimers, though. I will tell you that the talk that I most regret giving ever has to be a talk at ShmooCon back in, years ago, many years ago. I released a memory forensics, anti-forensics framework. And wow, have I gotten a lot of hate mail about that because I've made, quote, made people's jobs really hard. And They came out and said, hey, the attackers are using stuff because you put it out there. Not true, not true. It was inspired by stuff we saw in the wild. Likewise, most of the stuff that we've seen here or that I'm going to talk about today, we've seen in the wild. Don't hate on me if an attacker uses one of these techniques. By and large, we are probably not informing the people that are using these. We're by and large informing the people who are likely going to investigate this stuff. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not your lawyer. Talk to your lawyer before you do any of this, right? Because lawyers, of course, I'm from the US and we sue for everything. So, of course, talk to your lawyers, done, right? There is no such thing as a perfect false flag. No such thing, right? So at the end of the day, we have Lockhardt's exchange principle. If you do forensics, you know all about Lockhardt's exchange principle, meaning that every time you try to cover something up, right, you're adding additional forensic residue somewhere else, right? So the act of covering up creates forensics residue. I remember going to the drugstore a while back. It was a CVS or a Walgreens. Over here, I guess it'd be a Boots, right? But you walk into Boots, and right at the checkout, they've got the impulse buys. They'll like, go ahead and add it to your cart. And it was about a year and a half ago, and there's this big orange, and it was called Wipe It. And it was a piece of anti-forensics software being sold as an impulse buy at the drugstore, right? And so I stepped back and I'm like, wow. And of course I bought it. I mean, because how could you not, right? We wanted to see how this thing works. And sure enough, not a month later, it showed up in one of our cases, because of course it did, right? Now, when we start talking about this, right, they're like, oh, well, they wiped the evidence. And you heard Malware Unicorn talk a little about this, Amanda Rousseau this morning. There's no such thing as one of these. Once you understand how to do real forensics, we talk about PBF, that's push button forensicator. Right, so the people that just want to press a button, do forensics, and done, print report, right? That's obviously not going to work, and she already talked a lot about that, right? We talked a lot at my company about this before we came and decided to give the talk at Derby and then the big follow-on here. We really debated this and the ethical implications here, specifically this one, because we really are diving into a framework for how to, blame it on somebody else. And I got to tell you, I think the nation-state adversaries don't need help with this. By and large, I don't think they need help. I think the folks that need to understand how this works are the folks sitting in this room. By the way, if you are one of the people who's like, and now I'm going to go start a war, don't do that, please, right? Don't be that person, right? But I'll feel really bad about that if you do. The reality is we run into a lot of folks that misunderstand policymakers, as well as folks in corporate leadership that don't understand how easy it is to fake digital evidence. We call this the CSI cyber effect. This is basically where folks come in and they say, oh, I saw it on CSI Cyber. Amanda Rousseau kind of talked about this with the NCIS. I swear we did not coordinate our talks at all. Great minds think alike, I guess, is what it comes down to. But seriously, right? You start running into the folks that are like, oh, I saw it at NCIS, therefore you should be able to do it too. Well, it's like, that's fiction. This is reality, right? So before we get into false flags in general, let's talk about the goals of an operation. What are the goals here? And there are a number of these, from easy to hard to really hard. And I've got other up here because I'm sure I haven't thought of them all. I'm sure there's others that folks are like, but you missed that one. Yeah, I'm sure, got it. The easy stuff that we can do, though, is distract investigators. This increases the cost of forensics. We can sow seeds of doubt about attribution, right? We're kind of watching that play out in the US right now, just as a reality. We're watching it play out in the US. We can delay the investigation long enough to prevent some kind of action, right? We saw Israel bomb Hezbollah and take out a Hezbollah hacker den, I guess, was it about a year ago there? Is it possible that we could sow enough? Because obviously when you start killing people over cyber attribution, that's a pretty big deal, right? I can't think of a bigger deal when it comes down to it. And if we can potentially delay them long enough to either bring sanity back to that or, to that decision or whatever it is, maybe that window of opportunity passes, we move our people out, whatever the deal is there, right? If we can delay, that may be enough itself. We may cause another entity to act, right? So based on preliminary forensics, I think this is also medium difficulty. This is where we entice somebody to take an action, right, versus delaying an action they would have taken otherwise. And then the really hard one, and I might have put this up as extreme here, is convince experienced investigators, right, that the false flag is truly the flag, right? I think that's very difficult for true experienced investigators. Now, I've had folks come back and tell me, and even after the DerbyCon talk, they said, hey, Jake, man, anybody can see that's a ruse. Well, let's talk about bias here, right? Because what you effectively have here is of curse of knowledge, right? You understand what's done, right? As the attacker, what's obvious to you is not going to be to a forensic investigator. And And sowing that seed of doubt may be more valuable than the permanent obfuscation anyway, right? Just go look at Russia and Ukraine, because, of course, it's obviously not Ukraine interfering in the elections. It's obviously Russia, right? There's no question there that that's the case. And yet a huge percentage of the population in the U.S. believes that Ukraine may have been the interference and it was a false flag for Russia. Now, again, from a forensic standpoint, there's no question in the, in the educated, digitally educated community, right, that it was Russia. That said, the fact that there's been some seeds of doubt sowed about those false flag opportunities has led to a lot of political upheaval in the U.S., right? So don't overthink the false flag operation either, right? From the conducting it side, investigations are stressful, they're resource constrained. Remember the goal of the operation, right? I don't need to be perfect if I'm not going for permanent obfuscation. All I may be doing is plausible deniability or simply a delay in attribution. I also need to think about how sophisticated my target is. I'm going to come back to this thing at the bottom here. Know thy target's instrumentation. Kitty. Know what your target has available, because at the end of the day, I don't want to create false flag artifacts that my target can't see, right? For instance, I can't read anybody's name tag in the back there. So if somebody said F you Jake and wrote that on their name tag, that'd be neat. You might get a laugh out of it, right? But I can't see it, and so it doesn't matter. Think about your targets as well, right? What does your target, who you're trying to influence, what can they see? Because if they can't see it, it really doesn't matter whether or not you falsify that evidence. So let's talk about conducting that false flag operation. But before I get into this, I have to talk about the cyber kill chain. I guess I don't have to, but we do need to talk about a framework, and this seems like a good place to start. And I know people have feels about this, right? Good old lie. I saw somebody in the front actually just grumble. Yep, I get it, brother. Totally, I'm with you, right? Anyway, look, I have good feels and bad feels about this. I think the cyber kill chain is good as a way to help you think about the phases of an operation. I don't think it's great for defense. I think it's great for finding intelligence gaps and thinking about phases of operations. But I'm going to talk about the cyber kill chain because it's a set of deterministic phases, meaning an attacker must walk through all 7 phases to complete an operation, and they have to do them in order. I like this, right? This is good for me because, well, again, it keeps me kind of solid, or gives me a good framework to build off of there. And if you're not familiar with the cyber kill chain, these are the 7 phases of the cyber kill chain. How many folks in here know TCP/IP? I hope like everybody, right? How many folks learned the mnemonic for the OSI model? Please do not throw sausage pizza away. I'll never forget that, right? And I'm sure there's lots of, I'm sure, there are lots of really dirty mnemonics for that as well. We won't be talking about any of those since this is being recorded. But I had a student a couple of years ago. I sponsored a contest at one of my SANS events to get a student or students to come up with mnemonics for this, and this has to be my favorite, and it plays so well here. Really, why does everyone involve China always, right? And as long as you remember that, now you've got a good mnemonic by which you can remember the 7 phases of the cyber kill chain, because how can you forget that, right? Anyway, so let's talk about some of our false flags here, and I feel like since I'm going to pop my hat off here, and we'll go ahead and false flag this a little bit. I'm gonna play China in here with the panda head. Anyway, so the start with reconnaissance. What can we do for reconnaissance, right? So some of the reconnaissance techniques we can do, of course, we could buy, lease, or compromise infrastructure in the patsy country, or known to be used by those patsy countries. We could change our user agents, right? Yandex and Baidu. How many folks are familiar with these? Yandex is basically Russian Google. Baidu is basically Chinese Google. And they have Qihoo, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing, right? They all have browsers. Now, Qihoo is a little weird. I've got an asterisk there because 2 years ago, they stopped making their user agent any different. Right, so basically they now mimic Chrome 100%. Well, they've got an IE mode where then they mimic Internet Explorer 100%, but again, that's not going to help me anymore, but still cool regardless. I could change my referrers or the accept language settings. I could create social media links to follow known or suspected attacker personas, and then of course we could play around with some public forum registration and stuff there. So what about sharing infrastructure with the attacker, right? For red team exercises, you obviously can't go hack somebody, that's not legal, but you can buy infrastructure, right? And false flag attackers can too. There's a great site, whtop.com. They've got over 2,100 VPS providers all around the world. We use these, use whtop to get good references for VPS providers that they've basically done some vetting with there. You remember that Norse report? Couple years ago, it was 2015, 2016, where they talked about the big Iranian hacking the US infrastructure. They're hacking the grid. 100% of the attribution was done based on IP. 100% done on source IP. And I can buy infrastructure in Iran. very, very easily, it turns out. Basically here I can hop over and be like, hey, let's go buy some infrastructure in Iran. That's not 26 servers, that's 26 different VPS providers that I can literally, with a credit card or even better yet, Bitcoin, right, Bitcoin, I can go ahead with my Bitcoin then, and I can go ahead and buy servers in Iran that I can then send traffic through, and I can play my Norse report. It's going to be awesome. Right? And of course here we show an example of hopping over, and you can see, well, you may not be able to see from the back here, but this is an Iranian VPS plan where they've got VPS servers, virtual private servers sitting inside Iran that will geolocate back to Iran, which is, I don't know, awesome when it comes down to it. We can also fake personas, right? Now a lot of folks are like, man, this could take a lot of work. This takes zero work. This is a piece of work that Dell SecureWorks put together a few years ago, and these folks are actually targeting, you'll notice these 5 major personas in the middle there, right? And these 5 personas in the middle, basically what they're doing effectively is they're the ones that are sending the spear phishing. They were targeting a Middle Eastern telecom, or multiple Middle Eastern telecoms. And what they did, if you've ever gotten a social media request, I know one of the things I do, right, with LinkedIn is I'm like, when did they create the account, right? And are they connected to people? Right? Does anybody follow them, right? I'm not interested in because at some point, you got to have I don't know, it just feels weird when that account out of the blue, because I get hit with a bunch of bots and whatnot, something about Russia and pissing them off or whatever. Anyway, basically then you see this whole other set of accounts, and all these other accounts are just supporter accounts. And all they do there is follow these known, or basically these other threat actors to prop them up, right? Now, of course, all these are fake, right? They're all fake here. But if you've done some research and you found some of these here, you can become another supporter persona. And you can use an email that registers that supporter persona to go simply there's no mutual here. And in fact, if you look at the graph here, there's no mutual. It's literally a one-way, right? Basically a one-way connection there that's being done. And so you can do exactly the same thing without any impact on complicity on the part of the attacker. So that works pretty well as well. We can also modify browser settings. I love this, right? This requires zero tooling. You open up Firefox, you go to about:config, and then modify your language. I cannot tell you how often when we're looking at NetWitness or any of the other products that capture, do full packet capture, particularly TLS inspection there. Again, basically know thy target's infrastructure here, and know their target's instrumentation, Kitty, right? We have to know what they've got here, but if they've got full packet capture, they're capturing these languages. And so what I'll do here is I'll look at IP addresses that are popping out of ostensibly the US, but have their accept language set in Chinese, right? Now I'm not saying, of course, that you might not modify your browser settings. I'm just saying all things being equal, if I'm already looking at that request, where did that request come from? Is it being proxied, whatever, then yeah, again, you can do the same thing here, right? Now, again, we're not going to blame everything on China when it comes down to it. We'll blame some other countries here as well. But you notice here I Google for what does the fox say, and immediately I get back Google in Chinese, right? Which is awesome because Google honors the accept language settings. Now, a lot of websites don't, right? But that doesn't matter. At the end of the day, your browser is still sending the request and saying, hey, if you do support multiple languages, this is the language I prefer. And you can set multiple languages there as well, and it'll cascade down the order of those. We can also modify the browser settings, all right? So changing the user agent header can be especially effective in standing out during reconnaissance. We can combine this with unique PATSI IP addresses, right? This can be super effective there. And I know this is super hard to read based on the size of the room and everything, but basically what I'm doing here is I'm changing my browser to the old Qihoo settings here, right? So I could install Yandex or Baidu browser or Qihoo for that matter, but I'm actually changing that back. And again, I'll tell you that most forensics, I did a quick poll of some of my brethren, and most of my forensics brethren did not know that Qihoo stopped projecting their user agent in 2017, more than 2 years ago, right? So nobody, I say nobody, 2 of the 12 people that I surveyed that work forensics regularly knew that, right? So again, from that perspective, still probably, and again, these are forensics experts, not the general first-line folks that show up to do the analysis. So, okay, so let's talk quickly about weaponization, right? So get into the weaponization side. This is where we're starting to build either build some of our infrastructure, build some of our tooling. What are we dealing with here, right? So some weaponization techniques that we can use for false flag. We could start getting into forging document metadata. We can talk about rich headers, and I'll talk some about this in a minute. PowerShell code snippets, right? Certainly from attack tools, we can take code snippets out. You may have heard the old adage that there's only ever been one program that was really written. Everything else has been copy and pasted since then, right? Pieces of it. And sure enough, that's the way I develop. I mean, 100%, because why would I better to be lazy than good, right? When it comes down to it, I'm certainly going to reuse my code, right? We can embed content known to match Yara signatures and executables. I am still waiting to release a tool to do this. My lawyer has been really wrapped around the axle around terms of service on this, but that's coming. It's totally coming. And then Patsy language snippets here, right? And if you're not familiar with Umbrage, I highly recommend that you take a look at this. Well, if you don't have a US or a Five Eyes security clearance, I recommend you take a look at this. It's ostensibly, Umbrage was ostensibly leaked by WikiLeaks. Well, not ostensibly, it was leaked by WikiLeaks. It's ostensibly the CIA's hacking tool set and documentation around it. And one of the projects that they talk about in Umbrage, again, according to the WikiLeaks dumps here, is they talk about how to start to embed other strings around kind of what we're talking about here, right? So anyway, call that for what it's worth. It's something that if you are a defender, you should know about because, again, everybody else has looked at this. I say everybody else. Your nation-state attackers developing tools have definitely seen this. You should have seen it too by this point, right? What about document metadata modification? In 2016, the US elections, a hacker calling himself Guccifer2 released documents, and he claimed these were from the DNC. Now look, I'm not an expert. Actually, I'm an expert, but I've never worked in the DNC, right? So I have no inside knowledge about that, right? The document metadata, though, within seconds, right, you can figure out that it's modified. And some of the ways that I worked this out was by using a super secret forensics tool called EXIF tool that pulls out metadata from documents, right? This is free. You can go download it. It's awesome. And by running EXIF tool against these documents, you can see here that this somehow this presidential campaign document, Ernesto Che is the person who wrote that. Now, if you're not familiar with Che, he was involved in the Cuban Revolution as a communist. I am going to shoot in the dark here and say that there's not an employee called Ernesto Che working in the DNC, but there could be. I can play Occam's razor there. Then we could also look at another one here, and we could see that in a different document, this Excel document, where they supposedly had donors and big donor list, that the code page was actually in Cyrillic. Now again, now we have to put together, we've got another person in the DNC who their native code page for when they create a document, their native language in the document is going to be Cyrillic for the code page. Okay, that's not adding up, but okay, cool. We can work there. But this is the big one, right? Because here we've got the last modified by, and I certainly can't pronounce that, right? Because I don't read Cyrillic. We got the last modified by, but this is the cool part, because notice the number of pages. 231 pages, and the total edit time, 2 minutes. Now, I type fast, but I don't type that fast. I don't know if Hack5 is down here in the vendor booth. Their rubber ducky doesn't type that fast, right? Not 231 pages in 2 minutes, right? Now, I don't know what was modified in the documents or if anything was modified in the documents, but we can come to a conclusion, right, that the documents that were released are not directly pulled from the DNC and then released. I feel pretty safe in that assertion there. We can also talk about rich headers, right? So rich headers, this is an early portion of the PE header, the portable executable header. It contains information about the tool chain that was used to build it, so the compiler, the linker, et cetera. Now, what you should probably know is that each individual version of Visual Studio has its own compiler ID. This is awesome, right? Now, what's really cool is that if you download the Russian language version of Visual Studio, that has a different compiler ID than the US version, the English version, right? The British UK version actually has a different compiler ID than the US version. The hardest part is finding these numbers, right? I'm going to dump the panda hat here because it's hot. But anyway, so that said, right, these tool chain pieces here, they're difficult to find the numbers. Microsoft doesn't publish these, but it's here as a debugging thing. Kaspersky discovered in the Olympic destroyer attacks last year, was that last year? Yeah, it was last year. In the Olympic destroyer attacks against the Seoul Olympics, they discovered that the rich header data had been modified, intentionally so, and basically had taken Russian malware, and we at this point pretty well know the Olympic destroyer attacks were Russian in origin, and they had replaced the rich header with a known North Korean rich header. And that itself initially steered some investigators towards the, was this, and I said North Korean, Lazarus Group, which I think we're pretty well sure now is North Korean, basically steered them away from the Russians, at least initially, and towards the, basically towards the North Koreans. I'll tell you that developers are reluctant to change tool chains because it's a lot of work. There's a lot of stuff that has to get updated. And Maskim Dubik published a paper earlier this year, and I got to tell you, I am super excited about this technique. We're actually starting to employ a little bit of this with a couple of our clients, and it's actually showing some hugely interesting findings here, I'll just say. All right, so I highly recommend go take a look at the paper. It kind of walks you through not so much the malware side of doing attribution, but basically saying, hey, just through mathematical clustering, basically machine learning, can we find anomalies, and how many of those anomalies end up being malware? And the answer is a lot of them. All right. We can also mess with compile times. So the Windows executable format has an embedded compile time field. Every time an antivirus vendor comes to you and shows you that dumb graph, you know the one I'm talking about, right? All malware to date, and then malware in the last year, and it shoots all the way up. They're like, oh my gosh, right? It drives you nuts, right? Because a lot of those are basically a malware author sitting there recompiling, and every one of those gets a brand new timestamp. And every new timestamp comes up with a new hash, which is now new unique malware. All right? Ugh, it's not unique malware. But anyway, right, this timestamp field is actually pretty useful as well because developers, malware developers, right, picture my nation state folks, my developers tend to work office hours. My hackers work around the clock. My developers tend to work office hours. And so if I've got enough samples from a group, I can't always tell you where they're operating from, but I can usually tell you where they're not operating from, right? We can start clustering those together. And I can tell you, having been a developer before, it's rare that I come in the morning at 9 in the morning, roll right in, and I'm like, compile. Well, that's dumb. I'd have done that last night. And typically, that's when I end up like sleeping on the couch, right, in the office there, and it's like, doesn't compile, and then finally at 3 in the morning, it's like, I've got it, and then I'm too tired to drive safely kind of thing. That ends up being more kind of the scenario there, right? So I can look here, if I'm modifying these compile times, that can be lots of fun, and you can see these with a number of different tools. PE Studio is a great free tool that you can use to pull apart basically a bunch of your executable headers, but you can see here the compiler timestamp gets embedded there as well. So let's talk quickly about delivery. False flags when it comes to delivery. This is where things start to get a little more sparse. We're going to get back into the heavy stuff with actions on objectives, kind of that end phase here, but we've got a couple of things we can do. We can certainly use VPN and infrastructure providers that are known to be used by the Patsy country. We can camouflage our email servers to look to point to Patsy government infrastructure using port forwarding. I love port forwarding. SSH is so awesome when it comes down to it. If you don't know SSH port forwarding, I challenge you as you leave here, that's like the thing you should learn because I cannot tell you how often between that and natting with IP tables and doing net shell redirection, can't tell you how often that saves the day when Metasploit route command fails for any number of reasons, right? And Metasploit gets you caught anyway. But these OPSEC mistakes, a lot of times folks are like, well, that's just an OPSEC mistake that they have exposed some piece of infrastructure there. I'm like, neat. It also is troubleshooting. Because I've been on the other side of the keyboard. That's pretty well public at this point. You can Google me and see that. I've been on the other side of the keyboard as an actual nation-state attacker. I can tell you what troubleshooting looks like. That's why I'm not allowed back in China, by the way. But anyway, alas, when you troubleshoot, sometimes you do dumb stuff, right? And again, I've been on the other side of the keyboard. I hope I didn't do dumb stuff, but I'm sure it's happened, all right? Here's a simple OPSEC mistake, all right? Think about this. Little OPSEC mistake. I ran this morning for fun. This OPSEC mistake here, went ahead and added here. Now I'm not going to be allowed back in Russia either, but whatever. So alas, what we have effectively is DigitalOcean server back in the US in San Francisco. And what we did here is we used this nice SSH command here for port forwarding, and we set up a mail server, right? So basically, picture here, what I've done is I've used my DigitalOcean server or insert whatever VPS provider here. I've used my US-based VPS provider, and I've said, okay, let's go ahead and send out some phishing emails, spear phishing emails. The delivery is done. I'm done. I don't need an SMTP server anymore. Well, I didn't need it in the first place just to send, but then I fire that back up, and I've got that port there. And then when somebody uses Shodan to do passive analysis a week later, or they actually go back in an Nmap scan, what do they see? They see that my server is pointing back to this mail.mil.ru. Now, if you think this is like ridiculous, I see a couple people shaking their heads in the audience like, no, it's not. You may remember the Ukraine attack, the lights out attack. There were 6 IP addresses identified there. And one of them, for a very short period of time, very short being about 48 hours, exhibited something very, very similar to this. And I'll leave that out exactly what it was and when and all that, but I'll just go ahead and close and say that in that first Ukraine lights out, where Russia shut off the power in Ukraine, and I don't think that's up for discussion at this or up for debate at this point, one of these 6 servers that was identified for command and control briefly exhibited something like this. And I'm not saying that that is the one thing that pointed us back to Russia. It certainly is not. There's a overwhelming wealth of evidence. I mean, also Putin, for that matter, literally doesn't deny it. I think that's another good spot to kind of note. But alas, again, this is another piece of evidence, and again, it's something we can leverage, right? So let's talk about the exploitation side. I got to come back to Kitty when it comes down to exploitation. I picked on a lot of other folks. I have to pick on the U.S. too, right? I mean, it's not like we're not. Well, I'm not going to confirm or deny that we're false flagging anything, but I think it's pretty clear in the news at this point that we are, hacking folks, right? So anyway, so exploitation techniques, this is hard when it comes down to it. And it's hard for a lot of reasons, right? Because first off, we have to go employ the same general techniques that are used by our patsy. And that requires you to go steal exploits from your patsy and reuse them. All right, now I'm going to walk through a scenario where this actually happened in the wild, and is confirmed to have happened with Buckeye and Eternal Blue. I'll also mention that my company runs a security ops center. And initially, when we started the security ops center, I did it because a customer darn near demanded it. And I was very reluctant to do it. From an offensive side, I couldn't be happier because we now have a number of high-profile clients who get hit with a lot of very, very interesting stuff, and we get all the packet capture from it, and that's awesome. Anyway, I'll leave that there and kind of move forward there, but if you're on a red team and you happen to work with a company that has a security ops center, you should tie into that security ops center for reasons. Alas, most exploitation-related false flag techniques, these require a lot of resources, nation-state level resources, and they don't provide any real ROI because in most cases your targets don't have the instrumentation. This is another kitty, right? Know thy target's instrumentation. How do you see that that exploitation is the same? Again, this requires full packet capture, a very, very detailed logging on the endpoint. It's not stuff you're going to go pull out of the event logs and be like, oh, yeah, definitely, that's exactly what happened. We require some really, really in-depth logging, and most targets simply don't have it. But I do want to walk through a public example of this, right? Buckeye and Eternal Blue. Symantec released last year that they had identified this Chinese group, Buckeye, had been using the Eternal Blue exploit since March 2016. And this is very, very significant because when it comes down to it, it turns out the shadow brokers didn't release that exploit until April 2017. And I'm bad at math, but that's later than 2016. And so we assessed, though, that this wasn't a false flag. We assessed that China, basically, this Chinese group, saw that exploit in transit, basically on the wire. They captured it on the wire because what we're looking at here is they actually combined it with a second exploit, right? Whereas the Eternal Blue version released by the shadow brokers, the actual binary, whereas that has no problem, it runs by itself with one exploit. The problem that they were running into with the Buckeye version is that they were crashing all the time. When you crash with Eternal Blue, you get a blue screen, right? Anyway, basically what they were doing is they combined it with a second exploit that Symantec ultimately discovered through network analysis of Buckeye and basically pushed back to Microsoft. And what they were doing there, that second exploit, was de-randomizing the kernel address space layout randomization, ASLR. And so they were basically tying those two exploits together. That's why we assessed that it wasn't a false flag opportunity, but it could have been. I can't say for sure. Right? I'd say that it's probably the latter, right? It's probably a co-opting rather than false flag, but who knows, right? Anyway, good public example of that occurring. Let's talk quickly about installation, right? So some installation techniques that we can use for false flags. We could use similar host-based artifacts, right, that known patsy malware uses. We could use registry keys, file and directory names that follow a pattern. We could capitalize on that. And mutexes, oh my gosh, love mutexes. If you're not familiar with mutexes, this is another great one to go and Google when you leave here because it's a great artifact to find. Unfortunately, it requires lots of good instrumentation. If you're Googling and looking in the Windows side, Windows calls them mutants, right? So picture like an X-Man mutant. I have no idea why they left the mutexes and went to mutant, but whatever. Just know that they're the same thing functionally. Microsoft just calls it something different. So here I've got a portion of Muddy Water. This is actually an Iranian actor. And Muddy Water, we captured one of the rats and deobfuscated it. and it's a PowerShell rat. It's not very complicated. This is what we call a stage 0 or stage 1. Basically, it's the thing you drop first, right? It's a sacrificial lamb that can get caught, right? Which is why I suspect that we caught it, right? Well, not the only reason, certainly. But here, what we see effectively is this user's public. Now, again, depending on if you've got your settings set differently, then your environment variable, whatever your public directory is, will pull out differently. But notice this dri.dat, right? And I just searched for this, and even because Google replaces the dot and it can be anything, it wildcards that, and even there I only got about 1,800 hits, right? Which means that file name itself is fairly unique. And by the way, for the relevant hits, normally what will happen is if there really is a dri.dat, that'll be at the top. There was nothing at the top like that. It was always like dri, like there was dry.dat, right, kind of thing, like concatenated together. Right? It was just missing. Anyway, bottom line, this is a fairly unique file name. Did a Yara search for this, and I only came up with a couple across VTI, Virus Total Intelligence, only came up with a few hits on this. I think 3 or 4, something like that. So, by the way, all of them, unsurprisingly, tied to Muddy Waters. But if you also wanted to be tied to Muddy Waters, you could use that as... Now, of course, the trick here is, right, that you have to use something that is not so obscure that somebody will look at it and not make the connection, right? If they don't make the connection, it doesn't matter. On the other hand, right, if you make it too obvious, that itself might already be an antivirus signature, right? So you have to play around a little bit there to find the right balance, right, between those two things, right? Let's talk quickly about command and control, because this is where stuff gets really, really cool. Well, I think it's all been cool, but anyway, specific protocol variants used by the Patsy, HTTP server software and configure modules, right? We could go into remote language support, or they use PHP, Java, Ruby, etc., right? We want to mimic that. Again, remember, we're trying to mimic our Patsy here and look as much like the Patsy as we can. My favorite one down here, though, is the cipher suites, unique cipher suites used for encryption. And this is another spot where I'm going to turn you back to the Vault 7 documents. This is on WikiLeaks. Again, let me be very clear here, too, for the record. I am not a WikiLeaks supporter at all, right? That said, every attacker on the planet, right, nation-state attacker, has read those documents. If you are defending and you have not, you are at a decided disadvantage, right? That said, inside the WikiLeaks documents, or the Vault 7 documents, there's a discussion among whoever the Vault 7 developers are, right, about these folks called the Equation Group, and they talk about some of their malware, some of the Equation Group malware, and how messed up it was that they were using a very, very weird cipher, and how they wanted to make sure that they didn't do the same thing, because it turns out Kaspersky identified that and was able to go through and look and say anybody else using this weird set of constants that we would use to build this encryption must be the Equation Group. We've only ever seen it here, and anybody else using it must also be the Equation Group. And these folks at the Vault 7 side said, whoa, ho, ho, we'd better not do that, all right? Lessons learned. I like this, all right? Anyway. So here, again, I'm going to come back to Muddy Waters, right? So here we've got Muddy Waters, and I'm looking at my web page, all right? So basically here, what web page are we contacting? Now, take the base URL out for a minute, because we'll talk about that in a second, but on the base URL side, here, they're talking to game.php. Now, it turns out the game.php has about 935,000 results for being inside a URL. That's not unique, all right? But when we add this next part, news IID, that is super unique, all right? I can tell you that I went through just a massive amount of web logs looking for this, because of course it became an IOC for us, right? We looked through months of web server logs, months of proxy logs across a dozen Fortune 500 organizations, right? And didn't find a single instance of this. Not a single, well, we did find 2 instances that were Muddy Waters. We didn't find a single instance of this not being Muddy Waters, right? Now, if I found another instance of this, I would even knowing this is possible, I would have automatically gravitated as a forensic investigator to, yep, we've got him. We've got another Muddy Waters hit, until proven otherwise, right? And again, that's kind of what I want to get you thinking about here, is that it doesn't take much to throw an investigator off. And I will tell you, too, that when that happens, not only is it throwing the investigator off, it's throwing them off for the long term. They're going to continue to discuss. It will constantly be brought back up. Well, what do we think about that? Are we sure we're still discounting that as a hit? All right, and it's something that gets revisited again, and you are exponentially increasing the cost to do a forensic investigation there. Here's another piece of their rat, Muddy Waters deobfuscated rat. And I use PowerShell here. I can certainly throw IDA up here, but I know a lot of folks don't read binary, don't read assembly. Most folks can read PowerShell better than they can read assembly, hence being the PowerShell side here. That said, this JPEG download server directory, right? Check this out here, because this is where things get really interesting, right? Remember I said before, game.php, 945,000 results. JPEG download in URL, 46 results in Google. That means that Google has indexed 46 total pages that have that inside, not websites, pages. 46 total pages, right? That's pretty unique. If you copy that, you can have a pretty good idea then that, well, again, somebody's going to fall for this. So let's talk about actions on objectives, right? So actions on objectives and some false flag operation techniques. There's a ton that you can do with this, right? A ton that you can do with this. PowerShell transcript logs. If you are operating on a machine that is running PowerShell version 4 or later, that starts capturing transcripts, and you can copy a transcript from one machine to another and leave it behind, and we have tested that with a couple of our own forensic investigators, and the first time they saw that, it was not something they were expecting, and they took for granted that that PowerShell transcript must have been created by the attacker, right? And of course, these are lab scenarios. We run a red team. We obviously run forensics as well, so we had our red teamers attack the lab and basically use some of these techniques, and I can just tell you firsthand that they work, right? So let's talk quickly about some of the artifacts of execution. Now, this is a spot where I'm going to blow through here. I left these slides in here. These are from DerbyCon specifically because I talked about artifacts of execution there. And so I'm going to blow past these. If you want to see the video that's already up online, I left them here so that we had a full deck talking about the individual artifacts of execution pieces. Don't think I'm just blowing past this. I intended to do this regardless. I do want to talk about two other techniques, though, before we close. All right? So this is a big one for us, typed URLs. Lots of attackers use RDP. China loves RDP. If you've ever reverse engineered some of the Chinese malware, there are specific pieces of Chinese malware that not only have options for port forwarding, but if you don't know how to do generic port forwarding, for instance, you can't remember what port RDP is on, don't worry, the implant remembers for you. The malware remembers for you. It says, set up RDP tunnel from here to here. I'm like, whoa, you must be using it a lot if you built redundant functionality, right, redundant code paths in for this. Now, when attackers do RDP, right, when they get on RDP, they typically open up, if you're on a server, they open up whatever browser's there. And you know what browser's on your server. It's Internet Explorer. And when they go type a URL in, it doesn't have to be that they type it one letter at a time. They can paste it as well. When they paste or type a URL in, that ends up in the typed URL's key in the registry. And I highly recommend, if you're doing forensics, you take a look at this. And if you're not doing forensics, I also recommend you take a look at this because, as it turns out, it's really, really easy to fake, right? Because what we can do here is, right, we can take the initial piece here, and it's a most recently used. You get a counting list here. If the key gets deleted, the numbers automatically restart at 1, right? So if you had some anti-forensic software or something, we can go in and we can actually, using a reg command, we can go in here and add our own typed URLs, right? Using URL 2, 3, whatever. And you may or may not remember or recognize that 12shoppy.com, but that's actually a Russian command and control server or domain associated with some of the 2016 election interference in the US, right? So here we're planting false flag evidence and pointing back to Russia. You can also play, if you think law enforcement's going to get involved, this would require subpoena power to really play this out. But if you've ever looked at a Dropbox download link, I'm a big fan of this technique as well. Now again, you have to know your target, right? Are they ever going to see this? If they're not breaking TLS, they may not see, well, they're not going to see the download, definitely. You're not, in any case here, you may not be doing a download. You may simply be taking an IOC here to go, basically to go suggest attacker attribution, right? And so what we're doing here effectively is taking that user ID or that unique share ID and basically, creating a patsy there, right? And so again, this is kicked into that typed URLs key as well. I want to talk about one more piece here because this is phenomenal, word wheel query, right? And if you're not familiar with word wheel, we see attackers use this all the time too. If you ever use the search feature in Windows, and they do a lot, right? Because they're looking for files. I don't know, I can't tell you how many times on a domain controller I've seen an attacker RDP onto the domain controller and then use the search feature to find the ntds.dit. And I'm like, can you not write it down for goodness sakes, right? I don't get it. But alas, sure enough, from an intent standpoint, that's great. By the way, for those that don't know ntds.dit, that's the Active Directory database, right? But if they're on a file server and they're searching for files, one of the great things that this gets them is that the Windows search indexer, right, they can see inside of those docx and the XLSX, et cetera, they can see inside those files. So they can search for content inside the files as well through the search indexer. And it turns out that all ends up in word wheel query, and that's awesome, right? And it turns out that's pretty easy to fake too. Right, so kind of a walkthrough here using these reg commands. Obviously, you can bring your own tools here if you want it as well. If you're trying to figure out what this is, it basically is just Unicode, right? So you're looking at a byte followed by a null byte, ASCII byte, null byte, ASCII byte, null byte. That's it. Super, super easy to pre-populate. The final one that I'll mention here is recent docs, because typically once the attacker does the search and it returns a bunch of documents, they then double-click on the documents and open them up. And whatever user they RDP'd in on, whether that's a compromised user or whether that's a user that is basically a user that's being added by the attacker. We don't see that as much anymore as we used to, but usually it's a compromised user. If they've never logged onto that server before, everything that got opened was opened by the attacker, and we can presume compromise there of that data. Well, okay, cool, that's the forensic side. Let's think about the false flag side of this. Right? We talk about a threat, right? We define a threat as the intersection between intent, opportunity, and capability. And by far in forensics, the hardest thing for us to infer is intent. Well, here we're faking intent. If we say and we show with word wheel query, here's what we searched for, and then with recent docs, we go into the registry and we update the registry in a very similar pattern to what we just did there, basically we can paint a picture for the investigator that the attacker was very interested in looking for particular documents, and then opened particular documents, right, further confirming that, right, and they're going to write a whole narrative around this, and you literally can be doing this as a distraction operation, right? You know, they're looking for one thing, right, you're really looking for one thing, but you're pointing them over here in a completely different direction, causing them to make a different assessment. We are seeing this, not this specific technique, but we're seeing this being done with ransomware on a pretty, I won't say consistent basis, but it's definitely not been a one-off, where we've seen attackers go in with espionage-related motives, steal a bunch of documents, right, steal a bunch of data, and then drop ransomware, right, as a cover, right? So that's a little anti-forensic-y, right? They're not redirecting us yet, right? Well, with 2 cases they did. But anyway, short of it being, right, that this is definitely something that we expect to be on the rise here. I'll close with a couple of parting thoughts, though, because we're running to the end of our time together. A couple of takeaways here. I'm just going to tell you, sowing doubt, I think, is going to be a primary goal of a false flag operation. When we have determined that an attacker has false flagged evidence, something that folks consistently come back to in management, they'll come back and say, look, this is not convincing, right? Obviously, it's not convincing. You're not convinced. I'm like, great, I got it, right? But the outcome, the intent, might not be to fully convince us. The intent may be only to sow doubt, right? So that we spin our wheels, or so that we have the conversations that we keep having again and again. Matter of fact, I'm working one of these right now. I had to leave the speaker party last night at 9 o'clock to hop on a call that lasted until roughly 12:30. And by the way, that was not the first call about that. This is our 3rd week of calls in this incident, right? And every one of them is this 2 to 3 hour. It's analysis paralysis. These are the daily updates, not the analysis calls, right? So attackers, I'll just say here, attackers are seeing firsthand, if they didn't before, they definitely have with the 2016 election interference, that false flags don't need to be perfect to be effective. False flags are going to employ techniques at every phase of the kill chain. Really, why does everyone involve China always? Right? Don't forget that, because at the end of the day, a lot of folks are looking for false flags only in domains or only in, maybe some host-based artifacts. Again, we've covered ways that you can false flag across each of the 7 phases of the kill chain, and we know attackers must cross through those phases to get us to that, basically to get to the end of their goal. And finally, if the attacks are too sophisticated, they're ineffective, right? So if somebody goes in and does ridiculous false flagging, this comes back to Kitty, right? Know thy target's instrumentation, right? Real-world attackers we know are using these techniques today. Be ready for them in your investigations, right? So that's all I've got, and I have a whopping, I think, minute and a half left. So I'm not gonna go for questions here. If you have any questions, though, catch me in the hall. I'll happily chat with you, and I'll be around the conference the rest of the next 2 days. Thank you for coming out. Appreciate it.